I think there will be a long Trump honeymoon, certainly in terms of popularity. He's got some huge issues, Ukraine, the war in the Middle East. It's going to be really hard to get inflation down, and that is not something you can just wave a pen and fix. So I think it could absolutely come all unstuck, and the sort of metronome of politics swings wildly.
Right now, I'm still joined by Joey D'Urso, the Times' senior data journalist. Joey, at the weekend, you were, for the Times, you took a look at Donald Trump's first week in office. Was this a pretty exhausting thing to have to do?
Yeah, there was a lot going on. So these executive orders, which is something a president can just do at the stroke of a pen, they don't need Congress. And he did all sorts of things. He pardoned over 1,000 people, including the January the 6th rioters, which apparently is deeply unpopular with the American public, but he had a bee in his bonnet about it, including anti-abortion protesters who had been sort of out in the cold. They were pardoned. The man who founded the Silk Road, the online drug marketplace, he was pardoned. They pulled out of the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accords, some big sweeping stuff on the federal jobs, freezing hiring, banning sort of gender policies in the federal government.
It's almost too much to take in.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot, and it was all just being pumped out, these press releases on the whitehouse.gov website. Hard to keep track of.
Well, look, yesterday, Donald Trump's new press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, held her first White House news briefing since his return, and she announced a shake-up to allow new media voices into the briefing room. Listen to this.
This White House believes strongly in the First Amendment, so it's why our team will work diligently to restore the press passes of the 440 journalists whose passes were wrongly revoked by the previous administration. We're also opening up this briefing room to new media voices who produce news-related content and whose outlet is not already represented by one of the seats in this room. We welcome independent journalists, podcasters, social media influencers, and content creators to apply for credentials to cover this White House.
That is Donald Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, there, announcing that 2 seats usually reserved for White House staff would become new media seats, and those individuals would get to ask the first questions in press conferences from now on. Joey, there's quite a lot going on there, but I slightly love the idea of, TikTokers and so on being invited in, because if they want to do the hard graft, they're welcome. And if the American government thinks they're going to get a more sympathetic hearing that pays more attention to the granular nature of politics from TikTokers, they might be disappointed.
Yeah, and this all might change, of course, when things aren't going so well. I mean, Donald Trump is on a sort of victory lap now, and you saw that reflected in Leavitt. I mean, she's a pretty interesting person. She's 27 years old. Last July, she had her first baby. The baby was 3 days old, and then Donald Trump had this assassination attempt, and she said, I'm going back to work. It was a 3-day-old baby, straight in the campaign as press secretary. She's now standing there, 27 years old, and I was really struck by, I watched that press conference, I was really struck by how sort of not just confident she was, but also kind of cordial with the press almost. We're used to these incredibly antagonistic relationships between the Trump campaign and the media. I think that also just, as I said, shows their confidence. But if you remember the sort of hapless Sean Spicer, who was set out to lie about how big the crowd was back in 2017, it's just such a different vibe now. They don't need to do those things because they think, they've won this incredible victory and the city, the country is theirs. It could all come unstuck very quickly, as it does for many presidents. But right now, you can just smell that confidence coming off that Trump White House, which, might be pride before a fall.
I mean, you're right. It was always a battle, whoever the press spokesman was. Well, I mean, there were times when Kellyanne Conway did it. There were times when Scaramucci was there doing it. And it was always, there were figures of ridicule, basically, that the press could have a go at when they couldn't have a go at the president himself. What do you think about the new media shift there?
Well, this has been credited for a lot of Trump's success, particularly with young men. I mean, young people in generally have backed the Democrats in a big way. Recently, in the last election, they massively swung towards Trump, particularly men, and people have, this whole media ecosystem of Joe Rogan podcasts and TikTokers and completely out of the realm of the mainstream media, people like us, legacy media. The downside of this sort of media is it's not fact-checked. There's some pretty fruity claims about vaccines and all sorts of things. But, I think it definitely had a big effect on the Trump campaign. There's a lot of people now who no longer listen to the mainstream media.
But it's also, though, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think a lot of this kind of newer sorts of media it's sycophantic as well. I mean, because it's your ultimate form of access journalism, because they need to be nice in order to get to speak to the people they need to speak to. Traditional media needs to do that to some degree, but not to the same degree. We had a message while we're talking from Christine pointing out that Trump stopped all foreign aid as one of his executive orders. And it's the kind of thing, can you imagine his favourite? Can you imagine Joe Rogan hauling him over the coals on that? I'm just not sure I can.
Yeah, and it's completely unregulated. In this country, we have Ofcom and you have to give balance and all those sorts of things. If you go on someone's podcast, there are no rules at all. And you probably won't go back on someone's podcast if they're asking you lots of really hard questions about whether your sums add up. It's totally sycophantic. But I think a lot of the reason people like it is because it's not necessarily sycophantic, but because it's easy listening. If you're in your car, if you're fixing something around the house, do you want to listen to that really combative interview style? So I think that's a big part of the success of things like Joe Rogan.
Yeah, well, let's turn back to Britain for a moment, because Brits aren't feeling so great about their current government. It turns out YouGov's latest stats show that disapproval is at its highest levels since the election. 16% approve, 64% disapprove. That's a net approval rating of -48, and it's down 8% since the week before. Look, data's your bag, Joey. This is pretty bad data, right?
It's terrible data. I would say it's unprecedented, but it's not. Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, these people come in and they're instantly really unpopular. Maybe that's just what politics is like now. You saw it with Joe Biden. You could well see a Democrat president win a massive majority in 4 years' time. You could well see a Tory or even Reform win in 4 years. Politics is so volatile now. And I think the reason for that is that people are sick of the status quo. The economy's been flat. People's wages aren't growing. Inflation are bad. Of course you'd be sick with whoever's in power. So it was really dangerous for the Labour Party.
Do you think people are unrealistic and hard to please? Is that part of the problem? Or is it just that everything is genuinely, no kidding, really bad?
I think it is really bad. If you grew up in a world where generally your wages grew a bit, generally quicker than inflation, generally you could expect to be living in a nicer life in 10 years' time and your children would have a happy life. I think that social contract has been destroyed, and we can all disagree about why that is, but I think people have every right to be annoyed at what's going on.
Yeah, but it's not just people who are sort of leading the government. I wrote a column maybe a few months ago, just before Christmas at any rate, about how dismal Kemi Badenoch's approval ratings were. And she'd only been in the job like 3 weeks. What's she going to do? She's not going to fix growth. She's the leader of the opposition. But people just we don't have the, I don't know, maybe do we just not have the patience?
Well, it's this sort of plague on all their houses type thing. And I remember a year or two ago, there were all these massive scandals about Conservative MPs and people saying, oh, well, this benefit Labour. And I think maybe it did in the short term, but I think people just really hate politicians. And lots of these things just reinforce those things. And, a lot of the things we've just spoken about, new media giving people different angles, growth being terrible. I think it's very hard to be a popular politician these days.
What do you foresee about Donald Trump's honeymoon period? Do you think he'll have one?
Definitely, I think, because, he's really... People weren't predicting him to not only win the popular vote, but also win the House of Representatives and the Senate. I mean, that is playing politics on easy mode in America. You can do what you want. And the Supreme Court is packed with right-wing judges. And certainly until the midterms, which will be November 26, which is quite a long way away. Of course, there are all sorts of headwinds, but also... It's kind of a cult, the American Party. They love him. 50% of the population absolutely love Donald Trump, and the other half hate him. But there is such a passionate devotion to an individual in a way that there certainly isn't in this country with Keir Starmer, that I think he will have a long honeymoon. As I was saying, it could come completely unstuck. The succession stuff will be very interesting, whether it's one of his kids, whether it's J.D. Vance. But I think that's quite a long time away.
Yeah.
And I think there will be a long Trump honeymoon, certainly in terms of popularity. He's got some huge issues, Ukraine, the war in the Middle East. It's going to be really hard to get inflation down. And that is not something you can just wave a pen and fix. So I think it could absolutely come all unstuck. And the sort of metronome of politics swings wildly. But yeah, a long Trump honeymoon, I think.
Well, I mean, as you say, compared to a net approval rating of -48, then 50% of people loving you, I think is pretty good, unless I've got my maths completely wrong here.
His popularity has shot up since the highest it's been, I think, ever. Since he won.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed, Joe Dessa, Times' senior data journalist. Good to have you.